Hey, welcome to our channel, Ancient to Modern, and our 20th episode through our New Testament journey. And I hope we've been answering some questions. And there's a question that's come up about the book of Ephesians. And it's a question that not only I've had, but is out there in the culture. And it comes from chapter 5. Chapter 5, we have this well-known phrase. Are you ready? Wives, submit to your husbands. And now I've just made a lot of people angry. Well, let's talk about that just for a little bit, because I think there's a lot of people that really don't have a lot of knowledge with what they're talking about, that's throwing their opinions about this particular part of Ephesians. In 2019, that sounds a little harsh or a little different to our ears. But there's nothing that we do that's more wrong or sloppy than by taking ancient words and applying a 2019 standard to them. We have to go into that culture first before we lift it out into ours. Now, this is a section called a household code. Now, that might be a new word to you, but there's a couple of them in the New Testament. This is the most prominent one. A household code was well known in the ancient world, especially with Greek writers. And what they did is they would write how to conduct one's life and how to conduct one's household. And it's called a household code. Plato wrote one. Euclides wrote one. Socrates wrote one. There's plenty of them. You could look up household code, or this is a German word, Hausstaffel, because you'll find something if you look that word up, Hausstaffel, Hausstaffel, and it describes this process. Now, here's what the ancient Greek writers did. The ancient Greek writers wrote them exclusively to the male head of the household. That's the only person they talked to. Here's how you are to manage your home and manage your affairs. And it was only written to the men. And if you read all of the Greek writers, it is you are to rule over your household, rule over your wife. She is the weaker person, so you must manage her affairs. She is unable to. It's out there. You can read these yourself. And so it was only written to the men, and everything in this household code funneled through the male head of household, the paterfamilias in the Greek word. So anyway, now go back and look at Paul. Paul does something that's radically different, and as far as we can tell, the first time it's ever been done. Paul lifts up the household code, and he writes it not only to the head of the household, but he writes it to the wife. This is radically different. And while some people want to start off with, wives, submit to your husbands, look at verse 21 of chapter 5. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he goes into more specifics. Remember, there's a couple things here. Paul's very concerned with how the household looks to people who are on the outside, and us living in a way that is admirable in our larger culture. So the first thing he says not only, yes, wives, submit to your husband, but he says, husbands, love your wives and sacrifice totally for them. Find an ancient Greek writer who said anything remotely like this. It was no, rule over your households. Rule over them. Paul commands husbands to love and sacrifice. In the ancient Greek world, a Greek husband had no restrictions on him. He was widely expected to find sexual release outside of the home. It could have been with prostitutes, with concubines, with young boys. There wasn't a lot of differentiation with where that happened. A wife's role was just to keep a proper home, and be an honorable person representing the home, raise the official children, and she was kind of stuck. When Paul writes his code, he tells the husbands to sacrifice for his wives, for their wife. He tells the wives, yes, submit and love your husbands. It is a mutual sacrifice, a mutual description that is missing in the ancient Greek world. So before we jump off because we see a word that doesn't sound good in 2019, how would this have been heard in 58 or 59 AD? Let me tell you how it would have been. It would have been scandalous. Scandalous to even address the women in the same way you address the men. Scandalous to command the husbands not to rule, but to love and to sacrifice for them. This is what we see. One other question that I get is you go a little later, first part of chapter 6, it says, slaves, obey your masters. Now some people have said, there it is, the Bible is affirming and supporting slavery. Well, careful. Again, we take our context. And when we hear the word slavery in North America in 2019, we're transported back to 1836 Georgia. That's not what's going on here. In the Roman Empire, slavery was prevalent. Maybe 80 to 90% of all citizens were slaves. And it was a paid position, often paid quite well. We forget that Plato was a slave. It was anybody employed by the household. You had pedagogues, referred to in Galatians chapter 3. Pedagogues were well-paid slaves whose job was to raise the children. You had house philosophers, which is what Plato would have been, whose job it was to entertain guests, talking about the latest thoughts and the latest ideas that's out in culture. We think that Paul himself was offered a position like this, and he turned it down. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul writes and tells them not to become slaves. If slavery is so awful, then why were people willingly signing on? Well, because it was paid quite well. And, by the way, you could gain your freedom later. And, by the way, most slaves had a higher social status than, let's say, a tent maker. Just a common laborer, which is what Paul was when he was working in Corinth. So be careful when we take a word that meant something completely different in the first century Roman Empire and transport it back and make it equal to our context of the word in the 1800s. So when you say slaves obey your masters, if we want to be closer today to what that means, it would be employees be diligent toward your bosses and show yourself to be a good worker. That would be pretty close. But that's a different context then, so Paul used different words. So when we get to chapter 5 of Ephesians and we see these wives submit to your husband, let's not be really quick to jump into our current political discussion sloppily. First, let's go back to the first century and understand what's going on then and going on there before we transport it into now. So Paul's not a woman hater. Paul's not a raging misogynist. Paul actually is doing something pretty revolutionary at the time that was more equal toward women than any of the writers that was writing at the same time that Paul was. And when Paul says, hey, slaves, obey your masters, he's not doing this broad affirmation of slavery in our context. He's talking to the Roman Empire and real people in real time at a real place in a way that would make their life better. So anyway, I hope this helps. We're glad you joined us this week. Hey, subscribe to us. We're going to put this out weekly. Like us, and please leave some comments. Start a debate. We'll be happy to pick it up and respond to your questions. But we're glad you joined us. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.